it's really interesting that the gospel writers, for the most part, tell the story of Easter in a whisper. It happens in the dark. No one witnesses the actual resurrection. The story is passed from one to another with uncertainty. If you were writing it, he says, you'd write it bigger. You'd write it like Easter Sunday, with trumpets blaring, flowers everywhere. But no, most often the Easter story is told in a whisper. Which is why he says the Sundays of Eastertide are so important, the Sundays that come after. Because maybe those are a little more in tune with the actual experience of the risen Christ that those first followers and friends of Jesus had. Where the story is told with a little bit of uncertainty and in hushed tones. And so today we come to the story of Easter night. The story that I'll tell a little bit, and then we'll read the final verses of the story from Scripture. You'll remember that the disciples, having heard from the women, the very first Easter preachers, having heard that the tomb is empty, that the disciples and those with them believed it was an idle tale. Nonsense. Peter, however, ran and looked. And it so happens two other of the disciples ran and looked as well, we're told. Cleopas was the name of one, the other whose name we're not told. Perhaps so we could insert our own names along with his. And they're walking on the road to Emmaus. They've been to the tomb, they've seen it empty, they don't know what to make of it. But what they do know is that they saw Jesus crucified. And their hope is gone. And so they're heading back home to Emmaus. It's a 7-mile journey from Jerusalem, the place of the empty tomb, to Emmaus. They're walking along the road, and a stranger comes to them. I wouldn't tell you who it is, except if you were paying any attention to the children's time. And the one thing I do know is that people pay way more attention to the children's time than to the actual sermon. So we know it's Jesus there, but they don't see him. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him, it says. And Jesus wants to know what they're talking about. Because they are standing there, as the Scripture says, looking sad. And they tell him, really, are you the only one who doesn't know what's been going on here? Are you the only one who's not aware that this Jesus, whom we thought would be the one to redeem Israel, crucified? We heard there was this story that perhaps the tomb was empty, perhaps he was alive again, but who could believe such a thing? And so the two of them are headed home to Emmaus. And of course the stranger tells them why it is that the Christ had to be crucified, and why it is that they should trust that he is alive. But still they don't know what to make of it, and still they don't recognize him. Why are you so slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have said? The stranger tells them. But still, not certain. Until that moment where they come at last to Emmaus. That's where we'll read now the Scripture here. As they came near the village to which they were going, the stranger walked ahead, as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures to us?" That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon," to Peter. Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Pray with me. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You who are our rock and our Redeemer. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a walk. Walking along, I was totally preoccupied with my thoughts with some immense concern, which I cannot now remember. Paying no attention to my surroundings, deep in thought, trying to figure something out that eventually, I'm pretty sure, figured itself out for me. And all of a sudden I heard this gurgling. More of a rushing kind of a gurgling. And I looked up, remembering that I was actually walking right next to the Pacific Ocean. You know how the wind comes up over those rocks, those beautiful rounded, soft, not soft, but smooth rocks, and goes out and makes that rushing, gurgling sound? I'm 20 minutes, I'm walking along, waves crashing, rocks gurgling, paying absolutely no attention. And then suddenly there it is. What was always there. The Pacific Ocean, with its vastness, reminding me that just maybe this major dilemma, this major issue that I'm facing, it's not so much in the vastness of the love of God. Is that what kept their eyes from recognizing him? I think so. Something like that, being overwhelmed by their own concerns, overwhelmed by their own situation, overwhelmed by knowing that all that they had put their hopes in seemed now to be finished, their hopes dashed, their dreams disappointed. And yet there they were in the presence of the risen one, without even being aware. Luke says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Maybe they were kept from recognizing him for another reason. Maybe because no longer would they be able to apprehend, would they be able to experience the presence of Jesus with their eyes. Perhaps because from now on they would have to open the eyes of their hearts to experience the risen Christ. They would have to go beyond their five senses to really know that they were in the presence of the risen one. I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that the living Christ continues to walk with us on our journeys. Whether we're going to Emmaus or Encinitas, whether we're going to Jerusalem or Carlsbad, that Christ walks with us on our journey. And most of the time, we're not paying attention. Most of the time, we're looking somewhere else. Most of the time, perhaps, we're wrapped up in our own concerns, often very understandably, but not aware that the one who speaks the words of life is right next to us. And so I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the gift of our Savior, for the sacrament, the Lord's Supper, for knowing that when we gather to break bread, that Christ is known to us. And we can come to the Lord's table without paying attention and miss it again. But at least this is a time where we come, and it's not that hard to pay attention and to realize that perhaps more is happening here than meets the eye. I'm also sure that Christ comes to us at other tables. That when we break bread in a coffee shop and listen to someone tell us the story of their brokenness, that Christ is there with us as well. I believe that when we break bread in our own dining rooms and look around the table at the faces of those whom we love, that Christ is there with us again. Known to us if we're paying attention in the breaking of the bread. I believe that Christ comes to us in the faces of those whom we encounter, perhaps at that coffee shop, perhaps around that dinner table, perhaps in the homeless shelter just a few weeks ago here, perhaps in the face of one of those refugees, those countless refugees whom we see on TV and tend not to see them, but you see that one face. And there he is, the living Christ that lives in some way within all of us. And I totally believe, fully believe, completely believe that when we gather around this table, as we will in a few moments, and take the bread and break it, and when I look out upon your faces, I know with the eyes of the heart that the living Christ is here among us as well. Pray with me. Lord, give us the eyes to see, the eyes of the heart, so that we may recognize you, the living Christ, who walks with us always. In the name of the one who is the resurrection and the life, we pray. Amen. Let's worship God now with our gifts and with some beautiful music.